Let's now move to our fourth segment where we talk about European history, where there was kind of a resurgence of godly faith, of advance during the 10th to 15th centuries, kind of the second part of what we call the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. I would characterize this time as a time of sometimes even mass conversion of nations. And also on the negative side, this was the time of the Crusades, a very bad time in history. In the 10th century, for example, as we're now kind of moving along in Christian influence throughout Europe, there were a lot of mass conversions in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden during that time period. Number 27 on our list is Leif Erikson, which many of you have heard of. He was actually Icelandic, who in 986 took the gospel for the first time very clearly and very consciously from Iceland to Greenland. This was actually, Greenland's considered a part of the New World. Kind of high up, I know, but still New World. So this is considered really the first time the good news about Christ entered into the hemisphere of the Americas. Leif Erikson, 986. Number 28 on our list is a leader named Vladimir, who during the same century was trying to figure out kind of which way to religiously take his kingdom in what today we call Russia. And his grandmother, Olga, became baptized as a Christian. And in the city of Kiev, quite a bit in the news today, that's when the Russians first began to turn en masse to Jesus. And the Orthodox faith began to grow throughout Russia. That was in the 10th century. During that same time period, number 29 is not really a person, but I mentioned here the mass conversion of many people in Bohemia, which is where my family name comes from, southern Germany or southern Prussia. They were actually, many people baptized in rivers and streams, and kind of an awakening that took place during that time period, and also the nation of Poland. Moving into the 11th century was a time in which the Mongol invasion of Europe took place. Genghis Khan, famous leader in history, actually a leader of the largest land empire in all of history, was the Mongol dynasty. Largest land empire in all of history, stretching from Mongolia, of course, in the far reaches of Asia, all the way to Europe. And this was a tumultuous time, again, a time of great invasion again in Europe. We'll mention a number of things later on that brought that, but one interesting thing about the fact that the Mongols came to Europe is they also took Christian wives back to the Orient, especially into Mongolia and into China. In fact, Genghis Khan himself married a Christian wife, and Kublai Khan, who became one of the emperors of kind of the heyday of Chinese life, he also had a Christian wife, and again, it's because of the influence of kind of Europe going back to Asia. One of the great tragedies of the 11th century was the Crusades began during that time we call the Crusades. The first one was in 1096 under Pope Urban II. Basically, the Crusades, it's easy for us to think of them as evil, and they were a wrong reaction, but we got to kind of put ourselves in the cultural context too of the fact that Islam was basically killing everybody and taking over nation after nation after nation, starting with the Holy Land and many other places, and would have overrun Europe. And so it's kind of, at least we can understand why Europe at that point thought, we got to kind of fight force with force. Now that was wrong. That was wrong. It was terrible. But that's how the Crusades were started, basically to try to reclaim the lands that were being taken by the sword of Islam. During this time period, number 30 on our list is a man named Bernard of Clairvaux, a place in France. Vaux actually means valley. It was the Clare Valley. And during the time of the Crusades, when there was a lot of bloodshed taking place, Bernard was actually one that kind of restored to the world, in a Catholic context, the adoration of Jesus' humanity, and was actually against the Crusades and the importance of loving our neighbor as ourselves. His movement actually led to almost 350 monasteries being born in various parts of Europe, and made a great influence during that time period for Christ. In the 12th century, we find another famous figure, Saint Francis of Assisi. This is the 12th century. His original name was Francisco Bernardone. Wealthy guy who gave up all his riches to follow Christ. He started an order of monks. It was called the Brothers Minor. And of course, he was in the same kind of vote of a Bernard of Clairvaux, just a wonderful man who cared about the poor, simple life, creation, many things. But another interesting thing about Francis is that he also had a vision for, again, taking the gospel back to the Muslims. And he actually took a trip himself and actually witnessed to the Islamic Sultan during his time period. Kind of a rebirth of missions to Muslims instead of just war against Muslims. A woman I would mention during this time period was kind of his counterpart in his part of Italy and the Gaul area. Her name was Clare, and she gave birth to an order that was called the Poor Clares. By the way, I'll give you an interesting point. In Christianized Europe, there was such an emphasis on purity and virtue that single men and single women never looked each other in the eye. That was considered giving into temptation. Never looked each other in the eye. Francis and Clare, good friends, were part of different orders. She a group of nuns, him monks, but they never ever had eye contact, just because of the norms of that day of trying to stay away from sexual sin. Let's move on to another one during this same time period. Another monk whose name was Dominic became the leader of what became known as the Dominicans. You've probably heard of those. Dominicans literally means the order of preachers. It was a time period in history in the 12th century in which they knew they just needed to get out there and preach the good news and travel and teach. Number 33 in our list is a man named Peter Waldo, who again was a monk also, and started a kind of a famous revival in history called the Waldensians Revival. 1184, which really impacted France and Europe. It was a renewal movement in the Catholic Church in which, again, thousands kind of came to Christ and kind of got back to simple, godly Christian living and kind of away from the perverted institutional form which had been growing up as well. And then we move into the 13th century, a number of major events that are there. You've probably heard of the Magna Carta, the Great Charter, that was kind of a landmark, kind of a perspective on civil liberties, again, rising out of Christian civilization, which was being born in Europe and especially in England. This was in 1215. The Magna Carta was signed. It was actually written primarily by a guy whose name was Stephen Langston. That's number 34. Langton. Langton, no S. Stephen Langton. So he was a major author of the Magna Carta, which basically took Christian ideas and said, you know, these biblical ideas need to provide the basis for civil rights in society, the basic rights of human beings, which in, of course, the ancient world as well as in the Roman Empire were nothing. In the Roman Empire, actually, in its heyday, half the people were slaves. Half. By the way, a third to a half were homosexual as well, or bisexual. There were all kinds of problems during this era, which we call the Dark Ages. But Europe began to emerge out of that as more and more people came to Christ and the Bible began to be known. Stephen Langton did something very interesting. He was the first one to divide the Bible, Old and New Testament, Vulgate. It was being copied by, up until this time, copied by monks. He was the first one to divide it into chapters, into 1,189 chapters. Prior to that century, it was awfully hard to read the Bible and know where to go to read a passage because there were no chapters. There were just manuscripts. Stephen Langton changed all that. Number 35, Raymond Lull. Raymond Lull was, sometimes his name is called Ramon Lull because he was French from that area. He was, again, one of the first kind of clear missionaries to North Africa and to the Muslims. Those involved in Muslim work today that kind of say, wow, we want to be like Raymond Lull. He took a number of trips, stayed there for a long time, had a real burden for, we don't need to fight the Muslims, we need to win them to Christ. And so he became kind of the so-called patron saint to the Muslim people. It's number 35. Number 36 is Thomas Aquinas, one of the greatest Christian thinkers of all time, really the one that kind of began to merge faith with a godly reason. In fact, out of Aquinas really became the modern concept of science, where in science we could reasonably understand a God who created a world. And it was really the writings of Aquinas that laid the foundation for the birth of science, the Reformation, the Renaissance, many different things. He's known as the father of scholasticism, which was really the merger of faith in the Bible and reason from the Greeks. To put it another way, Christian faith is reasonable. there's a rational God who made a rational world, and so we can understand his laws, and that gave birth to science. 14th century, we have the collapse of the Mongol Empire. We have things like the bubonic plague taking place. You know what the plague was? It was disease borne by fleas and rats. The Mongols brought their hordes to Europe. The fleas and rats then got a part of things, and first of all, they got involved in the merchants and the various articles and trade things, and it was taken back to Asia, and the Mongol Empire fell because the bubonic plague broke out there first and killed off sometimes half of the populations of areas like China. It was incredible. Bubonic kind of refers to, bubonic means groin. These bulbs would be grown in various areas, and the body kind of turned black, and people would die in a very short space of time. The 13th century had a little bit of that. The 14th century, it was a huge thing. As well as by this time, a part of the church had become extremely corrupt, the institutionalized church. This was also the era of the Inquisition. You've heard of that in history, where really a lot of bad things were done in the name of the church. But I'd also mention a revival that took place in southern Germany during this time. It was called the Bohemian Revival. Kind of a renewal of that which had been done a few centuries before. We already mentioned that. During this one, 80,000 people were baptized in rivers and lakes, and some powerful things took place. Number 37 on our list is John Wycliffe. Many of you have heard of him. And the Lollards. Ever heard of the Lollards? That's not lollipops. Lollards means one to kind of put together, based on the Vulgate, an English translation of the Bible. That was 1382. And it laid the foundation for then William Tyndale, about 150 years later, going to the original Hebrew and Greek manuscripts and producing the first actual New Testament and eventually Old Testament that were from the original languages, not from Jerome itself. It started with Wycliffe, who was killed for his faith, as was Tyndale. Tyndale was burned at the stake because the church of that time didn't like what he was doing, and his last words were, "Lord, open the eyes of the King of England." Well, he did. About 100 years later, and when the King James Version came into being in 1611, 80% of it was taken directly from the works of William Tyndale. In the 15th century, we have three other people we'll mention here as we finish this section. Number 38 is a man named Jan Hus, or John Hus. He was a Czech from that part of the Bohemian or German Empire. For a number of years, there actually was a revival movement in southern Germany that was called the Bohemian Brethren, the United Fratrum, the United Brothers, out of which today we think about the Brethren and other kind of movements like that. He was a thinker that was a part of this movement during that time period. He also was burned at the stake, but especially helped to really plant the gospel in Czechoslovakia. He was burned at the stake in 1415. And then number 39, Time magazine called this man the most important man of the last 500 years. Johannes Gutenberg. The man who basically took what the Chinese had first developed but never perfected, the Mongolians, and developed the first movable type press. And it was in 1455 that Johannes Gutenberg printed the very first Bible, which would literally change the world. That Bible was in Latin, which was still the cultural language of Europe, but nonetheless, the very first book ever published was the Bible. It remains today the world's #1 bestseller. And Time even said that was such a significant invention of the printing press and how it changed the world and accelerated learning. Because remember, up until 1455, every book is being copied by monks. It's all being done by hand. It actually wasn't even until the 14th century that reading glasses were developed. Prior to that time, you became my age, you didn't learn anymore. You couldn't see. So even simple things we take today, like glasses or reading a book, that was not a part of the ancient world. So these were major things that actually changed the globe. And finally, number 40, the last one. There's a great revival preacher was preaching during this time period too, the 15th century. His name was Savonarola. Savonarola. He was preaching in Florence, Italy. And especially around 1489, a revival hit that town. It was actually so big that all their houses of ill repute and all their kind of entertainment centers, we would call the movie theaters of today, they weren't movies, of course, but they were all closed down because the fear of God just came down upon the town. It was just an incredible thing. So this is kind of the latter 500 years of the fall of the Roman Empire and the church growing throughout Europe. And all of this was just kind of by bits and pieces, God kind of developing the faith and bringing ultimately millions of people to Christ in this area we call Europe, that again would affect the entire world, including us.